Introduction to Fingerprint Exemplars. My name is Marty Ludis, and I'm a fingerprint examiner and the developer of the Fingerprint Paradigm Training program. In this video, I'm going to explain the concept of an exemplar with the emphasis on fingerprints and how they display friction ridge structure on the first joint of my left index finger. For this inquiry, I will discuss 5 different finger exemplars from the same area of the finger. You will be challenged to study the exemplars and interpret the coloration of them to determine the 2 elevations of friction ridge skin. Exemplar analysis will involve recognizing the registration of the recessed furrows and the raised elevation of friction ridge skin. When a fingerprint is made, a 3-dimensional surface is converted into a 2-dimensional exemplar that has length and width dimensions. Before we begin, let's look at the definition of exemplar. Exemplar, Latin origin, exemplum, example. Model, example, pattern, ideal. Suggests either a faultless example to be emulated or a perfect typification. I'm now going to preview the 5 different exemplars of my left index finger and give you a few moments to observe them. The first one is an in situ photograph of friction ridge skin. The next one is an in situ photograph of friction ridge skin with printer's ink, the recording medium. 3 is a photograph of an exemplar made with printer's ink medium transferred to a paper card. 4 is a live scan exemplar of friction ridge skin. This digital image is the current method of recording known prints during the arrest process. 5 is a latent print that I recorded on a glass and I processed it with magnetic powder. The powder is the processing medium. I'm going to begin with the most difficult exemplar, but I'm displaying this so that you can begin the inquiry with just a photograph of friction ridge skin before any medium is applied. I mentioned previously that examples of a medium are printer's ink or fingerprint powder. I am using the term in situ because the photograph was taken in place. Simply, this is the skin on the first joint of my finger opposite the fingernail. Here you should be able to recognize that the ridges are lighter in color and I can designate them with an arrow. The second exemplar is printer's ink applied to my finger and photographed in place, or in situ. I pressed my finger onto the ink plate and applied approximately 5 pounds of definitional pressure. I measured it with a postal scale. I am hoping that you recognize the significantly different appearance of this exemplar from the first one. There are 2 colorations represented: the black printer's ink on the ridges and the flesh-colored areas of the furrow that the ink does not contact. Hopefully, you recognize the voids on the ridges that are represented by round circles and indentations into the ridges. These voids are caused by the many pores that populate friction ridge skin. Pay close attention to these pores throughout this inquiry. The third exemplar is the old method of fingerprint recording made with printer's ink. This exemplar was made by pressing 5 pounds of pressure onto the printer's ink plate Then 5 pounds of pressure onto the paper card. Again, watch the arrow as it designates the ridge, the raised elevation of friction ridge skin. The fourth exemplar is a live scan print. This exemplar is made directly from the friction ridge skin in an image processing method where the ridge structure is recognized after being scanned. The live scan does not employ a medium like printer's ink. I will designate the ridges with the arrow like in the previous exemplars. The final exemplar is a latent print developed with magnetic powder. I picked up a drinking glass and put it down on a table. 24 hours later, I developed the print with magnetic fingerprint powder. In this proxy evidence scenario, I made what could be considered a ground truth exemplar of a latent print. Follow the ridges as I designate them with the arrow. Before I progress to another examination of the exemplars, let me review to the starting point of our inquiry. Our examination began with the term fingerprint exemplar. The fingerprint exemplar is generated because there are two elevations of friction ridge skin, the ridges and the furrows. The exemplar displays the raised ridges in one coloration and the recessed furrows in another coloration. We looked at 5 different exemplars with a focus on interpreting the coloration, differentiation of the ridges and the voids created by the furrows and pore orifices. Now the examination can continue with a comparison analysis of friction ridge exemplars, and I will introduce 2 exemplar concepts. The first concept is friction ridge registration, and the second concept is faithful reproduction of the friction ridge skin. We can undertake an assessment of these 2 concepts through the sequential analysis of exemplars presented in this video. Friction ridge registration is the exemplar attributes generated by the finger skin that display the elevations of the ridges and furrows of the print and voids formed by pore orifices. Friction ridge registration can be examined by noting the clarity of ridge width, ridge edge contours, the circular voids in the ridge line, the indented radius from pore orifices that penetrate the sides of the ridges. The pore orifice could be described to be like a very tiny or minute crater. The orifice or crater registers as intermittent and well-defined circular formations in the ridge line. The pore orifice also registered as a clearly visible concave indentation on the ridge line. Let's begin our analysis of in situ photograph of friction ridge skin. In this enlargement, the ridges are displayed in a light coloration. The furrow on either side of the ridges is darker in color. The actual structure and contours of the ridges are not clearly registered as the color variation fades from light to dark in the ridge and furrow. This exemplar does not adequately display ridge width, ridge edge contours, the circular voids in the ridge line from pores, or the indented and concave indentations. In a summary, this is a very marginal exemplar with poor registration attributes. Now I will display the finger skin with and without printer's ink. The printer's ink was applied at approximately 5 pounds of depositional pressure, and it clearly registers a black coloration. The skin tone furrows are displayed as a lighter coloration. Take a few moments to compare the two exemplars together. The first observation you may make is the left print, the ridges are white or at least lighter in color, and the ridges on the right are dark, almost black. With this coloration reversal, your observation requires white ridge registration interpretation on the left and black ridge registration on the right. Not too big a deal right now, but later in fingerprint comparison casework, you will recognize that ridge color differentiation of two prints can be difficult and confusing. Not to mention sometimes it's not even recognizable. A second observation you may have made is the coloration consistency of the ridges and furrows. This coloration consistency displayed by the exemplars is uniform. On the left ridges, light; on the right ridges, black. Remember this comment as you continue with the Paradigm coursework, because it will be revisited later. The third observation, the ridge edge contours from the ink are clearly registered with sharply defined margins. On the left, the ridges are not clearly registered. The ink provides significant registration capabilities for the exemplar to clearly display the pores. With my research and experimentation in recording exemplars, I've determined that printer's ink on skin is the preferred method to display and register pores. What I'd like you to do now is carefully inspect the photograph to determine if you can recognize any pores on the in situ friction ridge skin. Now, compare the two exemplars together to see if you can locate any pores that exist in compliant positions on the friction ridge structures. I'm going to designate 3 pores in the left photograph and also designate them in the right exemplar. That there are only a few pores recognized in both exemplars is a clear indication that the friction ridge skin alone does not display or register pores well. And my final observation involves the small structures I recognize between the ridges residing in the furrow area. These ridge structures are generally referred to as incipients, incipient ridges, or incipient structures. I will designate the incipients with arrows and then go over the definition of incipient. Incipient, Latin origin, incipere, to begin, beginning to come into being or become apparent. The definition of the word is somewhat misleading when incipient is used to describe a ridge structure. Incipients are fully formed. They are just smaller, and only the top portion of the ridges registered on exemplars. We spent a significant amount of time studying the in situ photograph and printer's ink on skin exemplar in an inquiry to understand how ridges are registered on the two exemplars. Now our attention will focus on printer's ink on skin to the printer's ink on paper exemplar. I have 3 exemplars displayed. The left one is the photograph of my finger with printer's ink on it. The center one is the resultant inked print made from the finger, and the third exemplar is the finger exemplar horizontally flipped to be in the same position as the printer's ink exemplar. Have the inked finger and printer's ink exemplar in comparison position. Let's determine how faithfully the printer's ink card exemplar registers the ridges from the friction ridge skin. Assessment by evaluating ridge width, ridge edge contours, circular voids in the ridge lines, and the concave indentations of the pores. The printer's ink exemplar process is a physical process where the ink from the finger transfers onto the paper. Though the printer's ink process is no longer utilized, it's very useful to study, especially if you are a fingerprint examiner who compares digital live scan prints. You may not have had the opportunity to carefully examine printer's ink exemplars. Allow me one more time to explain friction ridge registration. The exemplar attributes generated by the finger skin that display elevations of the ridges and furrows of the print and the voids formed by pore orifices. We made some entry-level observation of registration by evaluating ridge width, contours, voids in the ridge line, and radius from pore orifices in the sides of the ridges. Studied incipient ridges that exist in the furrow areas between the ridges. The second concept I mentioned earlier, definition of faithful reproduction of friction ridge skin. Faithful reproduction of friction ridge skin is an assessment process where the examiner determines how effectively and reliably the exemplar displays the elevations of friction ridge skin by the coloration differences of the raised ridge and recessed furrows. We can assess if an exemplar faithfully reproduces the ridge structure by making side-by-side comparisons of the same print. Let's begin with the in situ photograph, then add the printer's ink photograph, and then the printer's ink exemplar on paper. Take a few moments to compare the 3 photographs together and make assessments about how faithfully the exemplar displays the registration of ridges and furrows. In this comparison analysis, the in situ photograph fails to provide a faithful reproduction of friction ridge skin. The camera cannot adequately differentiate the ridges and the furrows in the photograph. The printer's ink on the ridges clearly defines the ridges, and the recessed furrows effectively provide a background for the darker ink. Under magnification, great clarity of detail is apparent. Here it is obvious that the black printer's ink displays the raised ridges clearly, and the furrows are easily recognized. This inquiry can now move forward as you compare the in situ printer's ink on finger to the printer's ink on paper exemplar. In your careful analysis, consider the words perfect typification as they relate to the definition of exemplar. In your own assessment, how well do you think the exemplar on paper represents the ink on friction ridge skin? I'm now going to enlarge compliant positions of each exemplar for you to compare. Now conduct a side-by-side comparison analysis of the two exemplar types. In this video, you have examined 5 exemplars of my left index finger with an emphasis on the concepts of friction ridge registration and the faithful reproduction of friction ridge skin. In your analysis, you studied ridge structure, understanding that the 2 levels of friction ridge skin, the elevated ridges and the recessed furrows, are recognized by the contrasting registration coloration. In these observations, the exemplar displayed ridge width, ridge edge contours, circular voids in the ridge line, and indented radius from pore orifices, and incipient structures. Finally, you were able to compare printer's ink on in situ friction ridges and the resulting exemplar it registered on paper. In the Fingerprint Paradigm curriculum, this exemplar analysis, which originated from in situ skin structure on the finger, is a foundational component to understanding friction ridge skin. In additional studies forward, you will utilize the printer's ink exemplar as the most perfect typification of friction ridge skin for examination and comparison purposes. I encourage all fingerprint students to record exemplars of their own fingers and study them under magnification.